Hello, Samson Strength Coach Collective listeners. On today's episode, we have Jeanne Rankin, Associate Director of Speed, Strength, and Conditioning at Coastal Carolina University. Jeanne, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, not a problem. I appreciate you having me on.
I'm really excited to get to know you better. Even just in our listeners always talk about the pre-show. It's always fun for me to get to know coaches a little bit better. That's the longest conversation I've had pre-show. So I'm really excited to continue the conversation and
I'm
get
a
to know you
I'm a
more.
talker, so it's not a problem. I can go
No,
all day.
it's fantastic for me. I trust me. The listeners are sick of hearing my stories, and I'm sure I repeated a million times. So it's good to kind of broaden their horizons.
Yeah.
Well, just starting off, can you kind of give us your background in strength and conditioning, and then what brought you to Coastal?
So I'm from Oklahoma City originally. Grew up, and this is kind of part of my strength and conditioning story, but grew up playing soccer since I think I was in first grade. And had an opportunity to play some other sports and just really like soccer. It's funny, I ended up as a goalkeeper because I'm 5'4", 5'5", but that's part of the reason the weight room is so important to me because you can't really be my height and be any good if you're not strong and powerful and kind of take charge of the 18-yard box. So played all throughout, middle school, high school, all that stuff. Got recruited to play at University of Colorado. Played my first couple years there, and I realized going into my sophomore year that I wanted to redshirt and transfer. And so I worked actually in the weight room quite a bit more with my strength coach, Sarah Ramey. And she laughs every time she hears me on a podcast because I always give her a shout out. But she's honestly the reason that I got into this field. Um, I'd had I'd had good strength coaches before, but just kind of having Ramey in the weight room, it's just not something I had thought about doing before. I knew I wanted to stay in athletics, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I guess having her as a strength coach really just turned a light on that was something that I could actually do. Um, so it was really cool. I got to work with her a lot more in the weight room, just be around her more since I was redshirting. I was actually the only person on the team who didn't travel because we had a pretty small roster. So she might have gotten a little sick of me, but ended up, I think I want to say it was my last day there before I was getting ready to leave. I told her like, hey, because of you, I want to be a strength coach. And when I transferred to Oklahoma State, that's where I want to kind of focus my studies. So transferred to Oklahoma State, finished out my playing career there. I had 3 more years of playing soccer there. Um, and then went into a GA position that was pretty atypical of what we do as strength coaches. I was actually a graduate assistant for the rec center. So I taught weightlifting and bowling. And the answer is no, I'm a terrible bowler, but I could teach the class. And then I interned in the weight room at Oklahoma State. So it was Coach Rob Glass and then a handful of other guys who were still there. That's a staff that stayed pretty consistent at Oklahoma State and enjoys where they work. So I got to do my CSCCA mentorship under them. My first paid job was at University of Arkansas. Um, I'm pretty sure Ramey got me that job because I had no experience programming. I mean, it was like interning then was so much different than it is now. Like we do so much more to equip our interns now than we did then. And this is not a dig on anyone. It's just kind of the way it was. But I'd learned how to kind of lead a group, but I hadn't learned anything about programming. So then I go work at Arkansas and it's like, all right, you got 3 top 20 teams. You've got women's cross country, women's tennis, and women's golf, all top 20 programs. And I'm like, I don't know how to program. And so I pretty much just mimicked my boss, Todd Barber, with what he did. He'd been in the field for a while. So it's kind of like a fake it till you make it, just get thrown in the fire and do what you can. And I went from, playing a team sport to working with 3 sports that were very like individual based. And I didn't realize how hard that was until I talked to my tennis coach. And he's like, you got to realize you're coming from a team setting. These kids are used to having a hitting coach, a conditioning coach, a this coach, that coach, and they're used to getting like pretty personalized help. And that was the best information I got at that time in my career. So I was just talking to the kids a ton to get their input on stuff, what they thought on a daily basis. And my teams were small enough that I could do that still. Um, and then that was technically a part-time pay job. Got offered a job at University of Missouri, Kansas City. Tremaine Carroll is the person who hired me there. True played football at Oklahoma State when I was playing soccer there. And he had said that, when he got to create a position, he knew he wanted to hire me. So it's pretty cool, 2 Oklahoma State alum get to work at the same place together. And I worked with every team at some point when I was there. I started with, softball, women's soccer, women's golf, women's tennis. Hope I'm not missing anyone. I'm sure I'm missing someone. And then True left me a couple years later to take a director job somewhere else. And so for the summer, I was the interim director of strength and conditioning. And I mean, it was just me and him. And then he left, and we didn't have anybody else for 4 months.
Oh my goodness.
For a period, I was the director there, which was a really good experience for me. And then finished out 4 years there. It's just kind of one of those deals where, you kind of outgrow positions, and it just happened to be my time to leave then. Was lucky enough to get a job at University of Kentucky. Got hired for both swim teams, women's soccer. And then after 6 months, we absorbed track and field. They had kind of lifted out of football's weight room, and then we took them. Kentucky track and field is pretty good at the time that I was working with them. So I worked with some pretty good athletes. Honestly, within all my programs, I worked with a bunch of really good athletes there. And then eventually, you just can't, when you get hired to work with, 80, 90 athletes, and then all of a sudden you're working with 130, kind of something had to give at that point. And we created a position who took over track and field. But I worked there for 6 years, and then moved up to Eastern Connecticut State for a year and a half, 2 years. Learned a lot during that time for a multitude of reasons, but so many of us learned so much during COVID. And to do that at a place where I was the only paid staff member and all that, like it was a different experience. And then ended up just getting the job at Coastal. Got hired for a good chunk of teams here, and now I work with track and field, cross country, and women's soccer. So been around a little bit.
No, it's fantastic, and there's so much I want to dive into because I think each spot you've mentioned something that's super interesting about each location.
Yeah.
I do want to start off by saying, and I'm sure Coach Ramey will listen to this. We're massive fans of Sarah Ramey on this podcast.
Yep. No, I've seen her on it.
She saved my butt over the summer, really helped me out with a couple things. And then she's been, I think anybody who listens to this podcast has some connection in some form to Coach Ramey.
Yep. Nope. She's awesome.
Yep. I'll text her right after this and let her know I spoke with you. The first thing I'm kind of curious about is, I just understand, you said you reached out to mentors or you spoke with your coaches during your time at Arkansas, but what was that pressure like when you first started working with those teams? Because initially too, I think sometimes it can kind of fall into like, oh, it's just tennis, or it's not like a premier, like it's not basketball, or it's not baseball, which is the unfortunate piece of strength and conditioning, right? But especially when it's your first couple teams, it's something where you want to put everything that you have into it. And then these are also extremely high level performers, What was that pressure like? And then, was there anything else that you did to kind of help aid you with that pressure?
Yeah. Well, I think for me, one of the things that I've always had a problem with in our field is how people do put more into their premier sports than their other sports. Having played, I think women's soccer is bigger now than it used to be. But when I was playing, we weren't an important team. And at two of the schools I was at, we were top 5, top 10 programs. Like there's other teams there that are, top tier programs, but we just kind of laughed because we were like, whatever, they can have whatever they want, but they're not top 10 in the country.
Yep.
And we took a lot of pride in that too. And we kind of had to, because it's like, we were all we had to keep each other going there. So I've never been able to look at it that way. It might hurt me in the long run. It might make it so I don't make as much money. I'm not sure, TBD on that one. But I think because of my experience when I was playing, I have a really hard time doing that. I wouldn't say that I did feel a little bit of pressure with my tennis team. And my head coach could laugh about this now. Like he had some bad experiences with strength coaches, like so many coaches have, right or wrong. There was nothing probably wrong with the former strength coaches he had, but he had some bad experiences. And so I remember like day one, he's like, hey, no squatting the team. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like my whole team in college, almost all of us squatted over 200 pounds. We had people squatting over 300 pounds. Like it's what you have to do. And I just went to my boss and I said, what do I do if this is a restriction he's given me? And Todd, had a meeting with my tennis coach and kind of figured out what the deal was. And I was able to squat them after that. But what I thought was like, hey, you can't do this. Don't ever do it. I'll get you fired if you don't, if you end up doing this. It was more a matter of figuring out why he didn't want that,
Mm.
and then being like, hey, Coach Jeannie's going to get him through it safely. I know maybe you'd had these experiences in the past, but kind of like work through it. So I learned a lot from that about, instead of just getting mad that they say don't do this, figure out why. But I also think that it's hard for a 24-year-old to do that. It's going to be easier, a seasoned strength coach. I'll use that word with Todd, a seasoned strength coach, to sit down and have that conversation. I think he did a really good job navigating it. My biggest concern was always just like, and how many people have this issue is like, I don't know what I'm doing.
Yep.
And so it was just constant dialogue with my athletes. I figured the more that I knew about them and the more I figured out, how do you play tennis? What makes you a better tennis player? What do my cross country athletes need? What do my golfers need? Stuff like that. The more I could figure out what they needed and what they liked and disliked, then I could figure out how to write up a better program for them. So it was definitely more like, I don't know. I feel like I don't know what I'm doing.
Mm.
So let me just ask my athletes and my coaches as many questions as I can. And they knew I was super bought in after that, and did a great job of guiding a young strength coach through it.
I think that's such an interesting piece behind it, because when you make that admittance, right? Or you say, "Hey, I want to understand this better. I don't understand it to this exact level." I think
Yeah.
when especially I as a younger coach, I felt like that was like me not being confident, and it showed like it would completely ruin the confidence of
Yeah.
the athletes in my skills.
Yeah.
But then it took me a long time to realize, well, it actually is worse, because then I'm pretending to talk about something that I don't really know what I'm
Uh
talking
huh.
about, and they can see through that. Like
Yeah.
they're great lie detectors.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, like the sports that I've worked with, they're used to being sports that they feel like nobody cares about them. So, like, if you're just sitting there asking questions about what they do, like even swimming, I knew I was going to take them over. I'm like, I know nothing about swimming. So I talked to my cousin who swam in high school. She taught me a little bit about some stroke technique. But then my first meeting with my coaches there, it's like, just help me understand. And they got it. They're like, nobody, there's not many strength coaches who are former swimmers.
Mm.
That's not really a sport that the field pulls from. So they went over some stuff with me, and then we kind of navigated it together. And then it takes, a year to start to figure it out. And then you kind of review it after a year, what worked, what didn't work, and then just try to keep growing it after that. And, after a few years, you kind of got something going that you're like, man, I know what I'm doing with swimming. Like, so yeah.
Well, it's just so nice, and that level of vulnerability, I feel like also kind of just helps build your relationship with the coaches more.
Yeah.
Obviously, I went through the same thing with basketball. You can just watch the video of me in this recording. You can tell I never played basketball in my life, right? I've always been a strength athlete, or playing football, wrestling, whatever. And it just my first year, it was just so hard for me to even figure out, like, okay, what is a jump stop? Like these
Yeah.
basic things. And then when I went to the coaches, I just said, "Hey, can you help explain this to me?" I just noticed that they were much more bought in what I was trying to do, because exactly
Yeah.
what you said, it shows that you're bought into the process and you're wanting to be better.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
100%. And even one thing I found is like, I played soccer my whole life, but there's a million ways to play soccer. There's different strategies and stuff like that. So the second I try to, think that I know how to coach my team better than they do, like they got hired there in that spot for a reason. They know how they want to run their system. They're recruiting the athletes. And so, even with the sport really well, I think it's a mistake not to talk to your coaches about how they want to play the game.
Now you work with soccer still, obviously. Do you still struggle with that sometimes? Do you kind of feel it like come up, or where you try to coach it similar to how you played?
Nah, I found out when I was younger, I wanted to do that more because I was so close to being an athlete, and I think part of it was the teams I had played with. We had been so successful, and so it was hard to watch games and not win as many games.
Mhm.
And once again, it's not a dig at any school that I worked at, but it was hard to go through that. And I had to constantly remind myself, if it's hard for me, it's hard for the kids. And so, I mean, I have had athletes, soccer athletes, come up during my career and say, "Hey, do you think coach should be doing this? Or what do you think about me doing this?" And I'm like, I'm not your soccer coach. And the second I try to get involved in that, it's going to break all trust between the coaches and I. it's going to break trust between the athletes and I. Like it would mess with way too many things. And at the end of the day, I don't want to be a soccer coach. Like you
There's a
go
reason you
ahead,
pick
go
strength.
ahead and make more money. Go ahead, make your more money. I would much rather be a strength coach. And I enjoy not having, influence on playing time and stuff like that. Like you could be the worst player on the team, but if I like you in the weight room and you work your butt off, great with me, and I'll make you a leader in the weight room. And then you've kind of found your place. So, but yeah, no, keep me out of that stuff. I don't want it.
Yeah. Well, that's somewhat of a secret advantage I feel like I have, right? Because I never get asked those questions
Uh
about
huh.
what our system looks like or what, I think the closest we ever got is somebody asked me what we thought about a recruit, who was coming
Yeah.
in. And I was
Yep.
like, I don't know, he's tall and he's got a long wingspan. That sounds
Is
good
he
to
good at
me.
basketball? If he's
Yeah.
good at basketball, I'll take him.
I've got no clue. Yeah. Well, but that's what's really interesting too about what you just said about finding the players who kind of work their butts off and then kind of making them the champions of the weight room as well. Have you been able to do that with each team you've had throughout the years? Have you seen that kind of build up those players, even if it's not
Yeah.
necessarily translating to the field?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of my favorite athletes I worked with at UMKC, one of my favorite soccer athletes. I mean, she was not one of the better players on the field, but I mean, everybody knew she worked her tail off. Maybe a little bit it was me projecting too, because like I worked really hard in conditioning, but I was still going to be one of the bottom three at all
Mhm.
times. So I think for me, there's a lot to be said for effort and how hard you work and how committed you are to your teammates, even if you're not the best at what you're doing there. So I'll always take, I mean, I've probably had athletes in every program where they're, middle talent or bottom of the line. And if you work hard in the weight room, I'm going to give you, if you work hard in the weight room and your teammates trust you and like you and look up to you, then you're going to have some sort of leadership role in the weight room with me.
Well, I feel like it gives them a specific role and something to kind of work towards.
Mm-hmm.
But it's always that tough position, right? Because you want to help build them up and you want to say, hey, the weight room can help you out as much as possible. But I've got
Mm-hmm.
some guys who can, squat astronomical amounts and do all the things that are
Yep.
check the boxes from an athletic standpoint. But then when it comes to actual playing time, it's just not seen the
Yep.
same. Yeah.
Yep. I've had to learn to be okay with that,
Yeah.
because it's really hard to watch that, but it doesn't mean you're a good soccer player. It doesn't mean you're a good swimmer. It just is giving you the tools to do it better. So
Have you ever had those conversations with players? Have you ever had to build them up in that style and kind of give them a better perspective of it?
I think I've had the conversations of sometimes your best still isn't
Mm.
quite what's needed. And sometimes there's better players, what might be viewed as better players sitting on the bench. Um, and I think having been in that role, and I'm saying that I've sat on the bench.
Yeah.
That's the role that I'm talking about. I think sitting on the bench gave me perspective that like you might work your butt off, you might be great in the weight room, you might be a great leader. It doesn't mean you're playing, but your role is still very valuable on the team because you can either be a positive influence on your team or you can be a very negative one. And we've all seen it, and we've all probably been a part of it. I've been a part of it too. And had to kind of, when somebody brought it to my attention, check myself and be like, oh, yep, I'm doing that. And it's kind of stopping what we're doing as a team. So I've definitely had those conversations with athletes about, maybe your role isn't what you want it to be. All you can do is keep working hard. If your coaches see you quit, then you're exactly what they thought you were, but if
Mhm.
you keep pushing, who knows? Somebody gets hurt, you know, whatever happens, just anything can happen at any given moment. And we might need you. And if you've just been sitting there and not taking care of business, you're not going to get put in the game.
Yeah.
So just got to keep plugging away. I've definitely had those conversations with kids, and I think they appreciate it because it's a different perspective. And then also me explaining like I've been through it too and I totally get it, and you just have to do your best to stay plugged in.
Well, no, that certainly helps, to have somebody who experienced it as well and then still continue to persevere and work hard. I
Yep.
love what you said though about coaches, you're proving your coaches right if you do quit,
Mm-hmm.
and it's almost, we talk about the self-fulfilling prophecy. You want to fight against that. If you're
Uh-huh.
on the opposite side, you don't want to fit the role that the coaches have made
Yep.
out for you and
Yep.
just confirm something that's completely not true.
Yep. Yep. And I've seen that, and I might have been that in college at one point too. I'm not, without really having discussed it too much with my coaches, but I know there were times in my career where I got kind of negative and, hopefully I didn't put it out on the team, but yeah,
It
yeah,
happens.
it's
It's
not,
yeah.
yeah, it's not going to work to your advantage. I can assure that.
That part is certainly true.
Yeah.
And the second interesting piece too is behind that is exactly like what we saw in March Madness. With Houston men's basketball. I don't know if you watched the
Hmm.
game, right? But they had a bunch of guys foul out, and then
Yeah.
a couple, one or two more went down with injuries, and
Yep.
so it came down to like a walk on, and then one of
Hmm.
their last scholarship players on the line, and ended up winning the game.
Yep.
Those moments, it's so funny because like are they ever going to happen? Is it going to
Uh-huh.
occur? And then all of a sudden it does. It's a
Yeah.
really cool experience. I'm sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's like when that happens, it's so cool for that team because there's a reason why they're so good.
Mm.
And it's because their culture, I'm guessing on a daily basis, is work like from top to bottom, everybody's got to work really hard. So, I mean, yeah, it sucks that people went down, but how rewarding is it for that, one athlete or two athletes or whatever who have worked their tail off all season? They probably don't want to see their teammates go down. And probably some of them were, shaking on the sidelines with
Yeah.
anxiety, but like then to go in and like help your team win the game, that's huge. And they deserve it.
Well, and I think you can tell also how close a team is by how they react when those players get in and get their
Yeah.
opportunity, right?
Yeah.
It's always like I think some of our players will always kind of be like, why are we playing these D3 teams and these
Hmm.
exhibition games or something? It's like, well,
Hmm.
other guys have to get experience in live games,
Yeah.
and then with our team on the men's side, I felt like it was the closest team I've been on, from the
Yeah.
standpoint of everybody loving each other. And,
Yeah.
our guys would get in and it wasn't like, man, I can't believe we still got, 10 minutes left in the game. It was just excitement. It was pure energy
Yeah.
and hype for those guys because they
Yep.
got their moment. They got their
Yep.
opportunity to come up.
Yep. No, that's cool.
Well, one thing that is very evident is that you've had success. You've worked with successful athletes throughout your career, especially across the board. It sounds like, I mean, almost every school. Is there kind of an X factor that you've seen? Is there one thing or maybe multiple things that kind of stick out and lend those athletes to have that success?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that sometimes gets lost is that you have to work your ass off.
Mm,
You're not going to be a good team if you go in. Some people say, I've heard some people say like such and such athlete on the national team is just talented and they don't have to work hard. That's not correct. Anybody who's playing at that high of a level has worked their butt off. Maybe you haven't seen the work they've been putting in, but you don't play at that high of a level and you don't work your tail off. So I think that's one thing that gets lost a lot is that from top to bottom, just like we talked about with basketball, like from top to bottom, you got to have people showing up every single day and be committed to one common goal. Like that's super cliche, but it's true. Um, it's and we talked about previously, like even if you're probably not going to play or you're not going to start or whatever it is, you have to work your role as hard as you can and don't forget about why you're doing it because it's really easy to kind of get lost in like, why am I showing up every single day doing this? There's no reward for me at the end. Well, the reward is when your team does really well and wins a conference championship or has a national champion for the first time ever in that sport or whatever. Like that's your reward.
mm,
So just showing up every single day and being consistent. Um, you know, I think one of the other things that I've had to be careful with too, and I think I've gotten better as I've gotten older, is just limiting the gossip. So like it's okay to have. I don't like having cliques on my teams, but it's okay to have your little groups. Like we had little groups on my team too, but it wasn't clicky. Like it wasn't like this group against this group or this person against this person. But just kind of limiting the gossip. Like sure you're gonna have some, but like it's just at the end of the day, as a coach, when I hear it, instead of, I think when I was younger, sometimes I would get involved in it. And now I've had to be like, okay, what's more important, that I sit here and gossip and have fun about it, or that I step in and actually build them into better young people who aren't going to do this in the workplace when they enter the workforce, and they're going to make their team better and stuff like that. So I think that's pretty important too. And then I think athletes being coachable. I think coaches being coachable. I was talking to my soccer team this morning because I found out one of my kids hadn't reported, some kind of pain she was having in the weight room. And so I just asked the group, like, are any of you other, is anybody else having this issue? And like one kid raised their hand. It wasn't anything major. But I'm like, listen, I've been doing this 17 years, but it doesn't mean my program's perfect. So if you guys see something going on, I know some people are kind of scared to talk to me because I'm sure that I'm so scary to talk to. But like, I don't think I've got a perfect program. The program is, I've been doing it a while. I've got a good idea about it, but I need some feedback from you guys. So I think having athletes who are coachable and listen to feedback, but also coaches who are kind of willing to listen to that stuff too. And I think the last thing is just like, sports have a little bit of a hierarchy. I think sometimes people think they don't want to have that, or it's like you want to be friends with the people on your team. The best functioning teams I've ever seen have, whether they're captains or leaders, they have those people, and there's different types. And I think back to when I was playing at Oklahoma State, we had, we had one teammate who would just rip your ass. Like she did not care. She came from a wrestling family, and that was just the way it was. And then we had, like the coach on the field who would like explain everything to you. She's now coaching pro soccer. Like she would explain everything in ways that we understood it better. You had me, who you were never going to question my work ethic. That would never be questioned. I might not have been the fastest person out there. I definitely wasn't the fastest person out there, but like you weren't going to question my work ethic. So I could talk to you about that. And then you had the one person who was kind of behind the scenes and would, kind of patch stuff up if anything happened. But it's like we had a bunch of different personalities. Everybody had their own role, but we definitely had a hierarchy of, this is our coaching staff. We're going to follow what they're saying to do. If we've got an issue with it, we give it to that one player and then they take it to the coaches. But there's just a system to it. And that's the way I think a lot of things in life are set up. And it's beneficial. Sometimes I think we get away from that. Like everybody should be even. And I'm like, I don't know if that's correct.
No, I think the playing your role is so key, because again, everybody has their own strengths and what they can do, and I think even when I look at coaches amongst the staff, now as coaching, like, right, like I think about in different roles, in different teams, I'll play different roles,
Yep.
Based off of what's necessary to kind of fill in, and so some teams I'll be kind of more of the,
Yep.
typical hard ass strength coach and the,
Yep.
what people would stereotypically think about. And then some teams I'm a little bit more relaxed and kind of the reprieve from some of the super hard
Yeah.
coaching, so
Yep.
it's all about how to fit and how you can find your role and how to help the team the most. I'm going through that process like today, actually. It's really interesting. We talked about beforehand how there's a new women's basketball coach here.
Yep.
I think she's been fantastic so far. I watched her practice yesterday, and I'm already bought in off of one practice. But from a standpoint of how I
Yeah.
have to approach the off season or how I coached it last year, it's going to be different under a new coach, right? There's like certain things that she wanted to emphasize, and so it's my job within the weight room, in my opinion, to kind of help maintain
Yep.
that, and make sure if you want people hustling everywhere, we'll hustle everywhere. Like those
Yep.
things I do think are valuable. I think sometimes strength coaches can kind of butt back against it a little bit and be like, it's my style,
Yeah.
but ultimately, again, what is your role? How can you help the team to be successful? Because at the end of the day, like losing sucks.
Yeah.
I like winning a lot. So I'd
Yes.
rather do what I can to help the team and help fill my role
Yeah.
than, be like, well, I'm Mr. Cool and I do my own strength coach deal and I've got my own program. I'd
Yep.
rather mold it and help from that
Yep.
specific role.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing I think it's gotten better over the years that I've been a strength coach, but it's just like still hearing too many coaches say, well, such and such would never change what he was doing or would never change what she was doing. Like we need to have a plan in our head, but you have to be able to change it.
Yeah.
And it still has to be good, but we can do that. We're very adaptable people. Like you just have to be able to do those things.
I think it's so funny because we bring up like lifting frequency. Like I can do the exact same program in 2 days that I could in 3 days or
Mm-hmm.
4 days or 5 days.
Mm-hmm.
It's all just being interchangeable. It's really whatever the specific needs are.
Yep. Yep.
And so again, that adaptability piece is going to be so key.
Yep. For sure.
Even an intern I had today, I had him run the women's golf lift. And then he was beating up on himself because he was like, well, I didn't do this well. And then I was like, well, because I saw what he did. I was like, what was something you did really well?
Yeah.
And he's like, well, somebody's shoulder hurt on one of the chin ups, so I had them do single arm lat pull downs. And I was
There you
like,
go.
okay, so as somebody who's been a strength coach for 3 months, you already have the adaptability piece, and
Yes.
you're coming along. So I think
Yep.
that part's so key. Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
One thing that is really interesting, I feel like doesn't get talked about enough, and I think your experience obviously on teams really kind of lends to you seeing that, I think, is the gossip piece that you mentioned. And I think in teams, I think of them, or not think, I know teams I've been successful with, there has been, like you said, smaller groups or smaller friend groups, but there's clearly a unified front. And then the
Yeah.
teams that have not been successful, it's obviously there's cliques. There's people who are completely separate. And
Yeah.
I've seen people not pass the ball to teammates before
Yeah.
because
That's
of
crazy.
specific cliques like
Yeah.
that. Like, in the weight room, how do you kind of nip that in the bud? How do you make sure that you can, like you said, turn it into a coachable moment? Because a lot of people see the weight room and the training room as the two spots that they can get away with those things.
Yep. Yeah. It's different with every group, but sometimes I like to fight fire with fire. I'm a redhead, so I've still got a little bit of it in me. I'm still a little. As I've gotten older, I've relaxed a little bit, but I can get a little fiery. But all something we did at Kentucky was like, your strongest rack of athletes were on rack 1, second strongest rack 2, rack 3, rack 4. Strongest meaning most overall weight. So obviously you got a kid who weighs 200 pounds going to be doing something different than the kid who weighs 100 pounds. But like with teams that I'm able to, I still set it up like that. But every once in a while, I'll just kind of mix things up. If I feel like, I know there's been years where I feel like the older group hasn't been pulling the freshman group along well enough. So if I've got, normally I'm doing 3 kids per rack. If about a third of my team is freshmen, sometimes I'll put a freshman in with an older rack. Instead of just putting all the freshmen together because they're weaker, I'll plug one in with each. And then I talk to my older kids and I say, your responsibility is to take care of them and pull them along. They're your teammates. They're going to help you be successful. Sometimes they look at me and they're like, well, so-and-so doesn't do as much weight. And I'm just say, figure it out. Like it doesn't, so you're going to change out a 45-pound plate.
Yep.
Like there's worse things in life than having to do that. Or like, well, I'm 5'7", she's 5'4". Give me a break. Like I don't have unlimited racks I can put you guys on. So sometimes I'll do something like that. Sometimes instead of putting them like strongest rack, second strongest, third strongest, I'll do like strongest, weakest. I mean, I'm not afraid to use the word. Sometimes it offends them, but it'll be strongest rack, weakest rack, second strongest, second weakest, and just kind of shift them in like that. I remember one time I had a group when I was at Kentucky that wasn't very good with communicating and calling each other out and just like talking at all during games. And we had a disappointing season. I mean, it was a miserable season.
Yeah.
Like it was hard for all of us. And I realized from when I had played, like one of the things that made us great was our ability to communicate with each other and people to be able to take criticism and people to be called out in a game and not get their feelings mixed up too much in it. So we did a full team workout, and this is off season, so it's a little bit of a smaller group, but we did a full team workout. And I mean, I just thought of this. Like I can think of I think of my best ideas when I'm falling asleep, which is scary. But we had, I think, 2 or 3 sleds going. And I said, it was something like you have to change, the sled has to change hands like every 20 yards or something. But then everybody has to stay within 10 yards in front or in back of the sleds the whole time. So if you're back there dragging ass, you better say something. Like you got to be able to tell your team, like, I can't cut it right now. I need you guys to slow down. Or if you're the person who tries to get ahead, the teammates behind you are yelling at you, like, slow it down. You're going to, something's going to happen for it. So anytime they got outside of that, I'd blow the whistle. They had to stop and do something. And I, in my head, I'd factored how long I wanted them to take. And so it's like, if you don't meet that goal, then we're going to do X amount of things afterwards. I'm sure there's going to be people out there who are like, well, you shouldn't do something like that. But we did a like recap afterwards. And I asked them, what went well, what didn't do well, what did you guys learn from it? And it was, well, so-and-so the way she yelled at me really got me pissed off. Okay, well, now that person needs to know you can say what you said, but you got to be careful how you say it. And that was one of her personality traits, anyways. So it wasn't anything new. And then it was, hey, so and so was dragging and she didn't say anything, and we had to do something because of that. Like, just speak up. You just got to say something. So even that one session taught them a lot about communication, and working together as a group instead of working in different silos. So I think there's different ways of kind of building that. To get back to the question, you just have to be creative about it. And what I always try to do is figure out what's the problem and what are things that I can do to work on that problem, instead of having like your normal, like, oh, we're going to do the really hard workout. Like, what's the purpose of it? Don't just do a hard workout to do a hard workout. Figure out what things you can kind of throw in there to help them with what they struggle with as a group. And then I like getting involvement from the coaches too, because they know more about the kids than I do. So like, what are some ideas that they have, or what are some ideas that my coworkers have that they've done in that same situation that would help out?
Well, I love that. One, I'm on your side, just so you know, from a strength coach, from the workout perspective. I used to be somebody who would always be like, "You can't do any exercise, or
Oh
can't
yeah.
do," because I had a sports psych master's degree, and then all of a sudden I started coaching, and I was like, "All right, now I get it.
Yeah.
It's a different deal."
Yep.
But the second piece is I do think that for a team to grow and for you understand the problem of communication, you kind of have to piss each other off every once in a
Yeah.
while, and it has to kind of come to a boiling point.
Yep.
And so, then people can be, in my opinion, a little bit more honest or more true with their emotions, because they're not trying to say, oh, yeah, well, this, whatever, this just happened. It's not a big
Right.
deal.
Right.
They're honest and open about it.
Right. I remember when I was playing in college, I mean, our fastest kid on our team blew all of us out of the water. And we would get mad at her every single day because she would sandbag it. Like, if we were doing 120s, she would sandbag it for 9 reps and then blow the 10th one out of the water. And we would just light her up. And she was an international kid. There was a little bit of a language barrier, but which we had to figure out. Like, you can't just get on her and expect her to realize what's going on. So in all fairness to her, we could have had a better approach. But I mean, it was just, hey, listen, like, you're capable of so much more than what you're doing. Don't hold on to it till the end. Push yourself every single rep. And she learned something from it. And then, like, when you're that good, it's hard to get a lot better, but that was important to us that she got better from it. And then she, kept pushing herself, and so that we could all feed off that too. But that's why it's all just about working as hard as you can. So I agree. I think that conflict is really important. And sometimes you have to kind of put them in a fire because they're not necessarily going to want to do it themselves.
I've done it so many times where you take a personality test, and then it's like, okay, here's how I want to be communicated with, or whatever. And like, I just remember like thinking in the moment, like I'll find out how this person wants to get communicated with based off of
Yeah.
how they respond to when I
Yep.
communicate with them,
Yep.
And so when I've seen it from the nice side, it's always just like, all right, how much is this really helping us, or is this just being, saying we're doing the right thing and being too nice?
Yep. Yep.
And so one part I'm curious about this, I hope this isn't a leading question. It's my job not to ask leading questions, but I think I understand where you're coming from. I do notice in conversations with other coaches something similar to those workouts, right? And you made the comment of some coaches may disagree with that. They kind of take the approach of those things don't really help. They don't help build a team. They don't, it's just unnecessary. Why do you think those things bring value? Why do you think those sessions, besides the communication piece or just any,
Yeah.
what is the value behind doing those?
Yeah. Like, I don't necessarily do them often. It's more when I kind of see something going on. And I mean, my gosh, I work with track and field right now. Like, you want to talk about monotony in training, which I love monotonous training because it gets them better, and that's their sport. But I do also appreciate the fact that if you're not a track and field athlete, sometimes you like to mix it up a little bit. I've told my coaches here, actually, like, if you want me to do a quote unquote fun workout with the team, you're going to have to specifically talk to me about it, because I don't do a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I do, let's get us better, but I don't necessarily do a lot of fun. But when I do those, what coaches sometimes view as fun workouts, there's always a purpose for me. It's never it's never something where it's just going to like destroy them.
Mm.
It's I am thinking out like maybe it's a lower body movement, then an upper body movement, and then a core, so that it's not just like a million push-ups in a row or something like that. So I think there's thinking behind it. Um, I think also when CrossFit came out, all of us wanted to just, trash CrossFit and talk about how bad it was. I've seen plenty of CrossFit gyms that do it the right way. And once again, I'm sure this is gonna, this will set some people off. But I've seen CrossFit gyms do stuff really well. I've seen them coach Olympic lifts really well. I've had coworkers who work within CrossFit gyms, and I mean, my gosh, they're great at teaching the Olympic lifts. And I think it's just about setting stuff up properly so that you're not running into those issues. And then if you do have a kid who just says they can't go anymore, then that's what I'll have a problem with, is that,
Yep.
if a kid's like, I can't do it anymore, and it's unsafe to put them back in that environment, or you see them struggling and you're like, well, let's see if they push through it or not. I think sometimes you need to be able to read the room a little bit. And I've not worked in, I'm not saying football is the problem. It's just that's what gets talked about. I've not worked within football, so I certainly can't say anything about it. And I realize the pressures of the people who work within that sport. But you just have to be able to remember at the end of the day, these are young adults. They have parents, they have families, they have all that stuff. And we got to take care of them. That's the most important thing always. So,
Well, I think there's the logic behind it, right? It's the logical approach that
yeah.
you're taking, which is, making sure that it is something challenging, which is, in my belief, the strength coach's job is to take
Yep.
people outside of their comfort zone
Yes.
and then show them that they're capable of more than they think they are. It's not to break them
Yes.
down to a point
Yep.
where they're never going to recover. Or they're, we
Yep.
see instances of rhabdo, like those things
Yeah.
are not valuable, but, actually enjoying taking people and having them, you know, do something hard and then watch
Yep.
them be successful. And then, most of the time, I think 90% of the time, the message is received and they realize they did a
Yes.
great job. And,
Yep.
you can see a different kind of person come out of it at the end.
Yep.
And what I love too is your reflection piece, is actually talking about the workout afterwards, and
Yeah.
actually, okay, what is this? What was the value you got out of this today? And then, so maybe for somebody who's not looking at it from a standpoint of, okay, how do we get better? You can actually put them in that mindset and show them, here's the importance behind the workout today. Here's
Yeah.
what I wanted to get done. And
Yeah.
that's why we got better. It wasn't just because I wanted you to go out there and push
Yeah.
sleds.
Yes. Yep. I think too, as I think about it a little bit more, this won't be surprising. I mean, I played soccer, like we ran a lot. Me being a poor little goalkeeper, I ran a lot too and just suffered through all of it. But a lot of my quote unquote more challenging workouts were running based workouts that started off as this, but then as the team, you guys didn't hold up your end of the bargain.
Mm.
Like, so and so wasn't showing up and doing what they needed to that day for whatever reason. So that meant that the team, I always say, like, if you got people who are struggling, it's the whole, like, you're only as strong as your weakest link, kind of deal. Like, if so and so didn't show up that day, guess what? Somebody else got to make up for it. I mean, the details kind of matter for me with stuff like that. Like, just hit the line.
Yep.
Just when you're changing directions, just hit the line. It's my pet peeve, so just do it. Because if you don't, you're cutting everything short. You're not doing the work. So when I see athletes not hitting lines on running drills, I'll calmly tell them to stop, go back to the start, do it again. And they usually know, oh, okay, we did something wrong, and they'll figure out what it is. And if they get stopped again, they're like, oh my gosh, okay, Coach Jeanne's given us 2 chances. Like, we know, like, one more, we're done. Like, I don't go off the handle for unreasonable reasons. They know that they're doing things wrong. And I think part of it too is when I do those conditioning sessions with them, they've done all the stuff to build them up to that. It's not like we're just doing like basic zone 2 work and then I'm just like, all right, now we're doing, 10 300-yard shuttles. Let's just throw you in and see how you do. There's a build up to it that I feel confident that they can do the workout. But I do remember, especially when I was a little bit younger and a little more crazy than I am right now, doing workouts that my kids for like years after would talk about. So like I got a text from one of the academic people at UMKC. It was 4 years after I had finished up. And she's like, well, all the senior speeches officially now, don't have anything about Coach Jeanne in them because they would talk about like, yeah, I remember my first day, this was the workout we did with Coach Jeanne, or like, I remember my first spring, we were doing stadiums and blah, 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 Coach Jeanne. And I'm just like, I'm kind of glad that those stories are over with because it makes me nervous every time I hear about it. But they did say that for years after that, when a game would get tough, this is so funny to me, but they're like, when a game would get tough, I remembered a workout that we did with you.
Mm.
I'm like, man, if nothing else, like it made you realize that you've done something tougher than what you're doing in a game or what you're doing on a daily basis. So I might disagree on whether that was actually tougher or not, but it's something that stuck with you that it was like, if I can do that, then I can do anything.
Again, that's the whole goal, right? Is to show them that they can do these things. They can
Yep.
do hard things,
Yep.
and I think it's so, I don't know. I can go on a massive rant here and,
Yeah.
talk about the transfer portal, whatever, and those things. But I think that's the job of the strength coach, in my
Yeah.
opinion, and one thing too, to speak about your, kind of rules within the, sessions, like one piece of advice I got from a coach I thought has worked fantastic is, if you miss your time, that's on you, and I can judge by effort,
Mm-hmm.
right? But if you false start, if you miss a line, if you mess somebody else up, that's on the whole team,
Mm-hmm.
And so just the small details, the things
Mm-hmm.
that everybody can do right 100% of the time, I've watched it work really well,
Yeah.
and also it's kind of helped me sometimes because my post player times are hard, and sometimes you got
Yeah.
post players who can't necessarily make
Yeah.
those, and so it's just us at the end doing extra work, and I'm
Yeah.
not overtraining the rest of the team.
Yeah, no, you talk about like goalkeepers within a soccer team and maybe making different standards for them. Basketball is a whole different thing.
Yeah, it's completely insane. I mean, we've got some guys who the 3/4 court dash is like a marvel.
Yeah.
You wouldn't believe how fast they run it. And then I've got some some guys I'm like,
Yeah.
man, we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Well, Coach, I mean, thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation. It's been really great to get to know you, and I mean, it's I feel like I've learned a lot, honestly, and there's some things I want to reflect on within my program that you brought up today. I think that are going to help me. So I really think the listeners will feel the same.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me on. And it's always fun doing a podcast and meeting new people and just kind of getting feedback on stuff. So I've enjoyed it.
Absolutely. And by the way, just for the listeners, the Coastal Carolina staff, some of the nicest people I've ever met in my life. Okay. So, we were just talking pre-show as well. I've met two great coaches from there and now a third. So it's been awesome to get to know your whole staff.
Yep. Anybody's welcome at any time. Just give us a call.
Perfect. Well, thank you.
Thank you.